Good morning. I'm going to do something today that most preachers have, I dare say, never done. Are you ready for it? Are you sure? Because you're probably not going to like it. Today, I'm going to preach from the book of Leviticus, which some people think is probably the most boring book in the Bible. I don't think that's the case. So the passage today is Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 15 to 18. You know what to do. Pause the video now, read Leviticus 19, 1 to 2, and 15 through 18, then come on back with me. So I think a lot of people, when they think of Leviticus, they think, isn't that the book with all the rules and regulations that tells you what you can eat and what you can't eat? And, that's not wrong. And do you know the first food that Leviticus says you should not eat? Mayonnaise. Just kidding. Inside joke from last week's sermon. Leviticus is filled with rules and regulations. And if you were to sit down and read it all at one time, it would be awfully boring. If you were to sit down and eat a whole mess of raw Brussels sprouts at one time, it would be awfully awful. But if you cook them with some bacon and drizzle some honey on them, maybe pair them with a steak, then now we're talking, right? I'm getting kind of hungry on a Sunday morning thinking about that. The same thing is true of Leviticus. If you cook it the right way, in the right quantities, it's so good. It's so good. In the beginning of chapter 19, God gives Moses a message for all the people. And it's real simple. This is probably one section of Leviticus. Maybe you didn't know it was from Leviticus, but you probably heard it before, where God says, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." Now, let's stop right there for a minute before we dig into the rest of the passage and dig down into that one sentence. You shall be holy, for I am holy. What does it mean to be holy? Well, in the original language of the Old Testament, in biblical Hebrew, the word kadosh means sacred, holy, or of God. The things of God are sacred and holy. They're set apart. Set apart from what? Well, from everything else. There are things that are of God, and then there's everything else. You shall be set apart, God says, for I am set apart. You shall be holy, for I am holy. Being holy is really the point of Leviticus. All the rules and regulations about animals and sickness and food and sexual practices and speech and cleanliness are there to try and teach us holiness. In fact, this part of the Bible is called the Holiness Code. It's thought to be one of the oldest sections, one of the most ancient sections found in the entire scriptures. The thing that most people get wrong about the Holiness Code, and it's easy to understand why, but the complexity of it. They think it's real simple and real black and white and real straightforward, and the Holiness Code is not. It's nuanced. It's difficult. It's complex. It's not just a list of rules. It doesn't say, do this and you will be holy, or don't do that and you will be holy. It lays out everyday life scenarios full of gray areas and complexity and tough decisions before arriving at the right thing to do in that situation. Think about with me just for a second as an example of that, verse 17. Verse 17 says, "You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself." Make this real for a moment in your own mind. Imagine a relative of yours does something really rotten. something that hurts you, hurts other members of your family, how do you respond to that? Well, according to the Holiness Code, you have a responsibility that goes in a couple different directions. You have a responsibility not to let hate take hold in your heart when that rotten thing happens to you. But that doesn't mean you're supposed to just let it go, because you also have a responsibility to correct the person, to name what was done, to say it was wrong, and to try and repair whatever's been broken. And if you don't meet these responsibilities, Leviticus says, when someone does wrong to you, then you've wronged them by allowing unholy things to happen without correcting them. You become unholy. That's a lot to think about. And I don't want you to get it twisted. Don't go out to lunch and punch Uncle Eddie in the face today when he brings up family drama at the dinner table because your pastor taught you that Leviticus said you can. That's not what it says. That's not what I'm saying. What Leviticus says is that holiness has a price. If you want to be holy, for the Lord is holy, you have to be willing to walk the extra mile. And the next verse, verse 18, tells us how. Verse 18 says, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Walking the extra mile, seeing the various responsibilities in a situation in which you're involved, both of those things require love. Anybody can lash out. It takes a special, dare I say, holy person to correct another in love. Anybody can walk away too. It takes a special, dare I say, holy person to correct another in love and to be corrected in love. Here's the way I like to think about it. And this is where I think Leviticus is really undervalued, and we need to pay more attention to it. Holiness is often about finding the middle ground between two extremes. Verse 15 says, you shouldn't love someone just because they're poor, and you shouldn't love someone just because they're important. You should judge everyone justly with love in your hearts. It's about finding the mean between the extremes. So think about that from a different perspective. Think about courage, for example. What is courage if it's about finding the mean between extremes? Well, courage is the mean between being a daredevil on the one hand and being a coward on the other. It's the mean between extremes. It's taking action, taking responsible action. For centuries, from Aristotle to the Bible to C.S. Lewis, this idea has been the rule of thumb for being a good person, for virtue, for holiness, finding the mean between extremes. Take the example before from when your family member does something rotten to somebody else in the family. How do you respond to that? Well, you could say something that you know will hurt them and tell them that you never want to see them again because you're so upset about what they've done and you want to take up for the people that they've hurt. That's one extreme. Besides punching Uncle Eddie in the face, that's another version of that extreme. On the other extreme, you could say absolutely nothing. Never acknowledge it. Try and just get along with everybody. Two extreme paths. And those two extreme paths point you towards the holy thing to do in that situation. Be honest with the person about what they've done, correct them in love, and give them a chance to make a change. Now, this sermon may not have been as good as Brussels sprouts cooked with bacon and honey, but I hope you see the good in Leviticus. It's not just a book of rules and regulations. It's not just a book telling you what you can and you can't eat. It's a book of wisdom, teaching us that holiness is not some magical virtue reserved for saints or angels. Holiness is the mean between extremes, which we seek to find every single day in our lives with God and each other. Amen.